The Big Fat Surprise: Why Butter, Meat, and Cheese Belong in a Healthy Diet by Nina Teicholz. Picture this. It's the early 1900s, and a young Harvard anthropologist named Wilhelm Stefansson is about to do something completely bonkers. Instead of studying the Inuit people of the Canadian Arctic from a comfortable distance, he decides to actually become one of them. For years he learns to hunt, fish, and, most importantly, eat exactly as they do. And oh boy, what a diet it was. 9 months a year, nothing but caribou. The rest of the time, pure salmon, with a brief egg-eating frenzy each spring. Vegetables were basically non-existent. Stefansson noted that the Inuit only ate plants during famines. Here's the real kicker, though. Roughly 80% of their calories came from fat. The fatty bits, behind the caribou's eyes and along its jaw. Those were the delicacies everyone fought over. That lean, tender meat we'd consider prime steak, dog food. By every measure of conventional wisdom, these people should have been walking heart attacks. But here's what blew Stefansson's mind. The Inuit were the healthiest population he'd ever encountered. 0 obesity. No disease to speak of. When he got back to civilization and told his story, people thought he'd lost his marbles. The whole thing sounded absurd. So in 1928, Stefansson decided to put his money where his mouth was. He and a colleague checked into Bellevue Hospital in New York City, where skeptical scientists could watch their every move. Their goal? Eat nothing but meat and fat for an entire year. The public freaked out. Friends literally warned them they were committing suicide. Yet after 12 months of gorging on fatty steaks, bacon-fried brains, and boiled ribs, the verdict came in. Both men were in pristine health. Stefansson stuck with this diet for most of his life and lived to be 82. Active and healthy until the end. This story is like a glitch in the matrix. It contradicts 60 years of everything we've been told about healthy eating. We've had it hammered into our heads that fat, especially the saturated kind in meat and butter, is basically poison. We've been handed food pyramids that put grains at the bottom and banish fats to the tippy top, marked "use sparingly or else." But what if that entire pyramid was built on quicksand? What if the fear driving our dietary choices for generations wasn't rooted in solid science at all, but in flawed evidence, personal ambition, and a story so convenient that nobody bothered to question it? That's exactly what we're diving into today, guided by investigative journalist Nina Teicholz and her extraordinary book, The Big Fat Surprise. This isn't just another diet book. It's a detective story that took Teicholz nearly a decade to piece together. Wading through thousands of scientific papers and interviewing hundreds of experts to unravel one of the biggest scientific blunders in modern history. By the time we're done, you'll understand the real story behind our fear of fat. You'll see how one incredibly ambitious scientist launched an idea that conquered the world, and how the institutions we trust turned it into gospel before it was ever properly proven. Most importantly, you'll discover the surprising, even liberating truth about why butter, meat, and cheese might just deserve a place back on your plate. This is the story of how we got our diet spectacularly wrong, and how we can finally start getting it right. Our story kicks off in an era of genuine terror. In the years following World War II, a frightening epidemic was tearing through America. Men in their prime, seemingly healthy guys at the office or on the golf course, were suddenly dropping dead from heart attacks. The disease appeared out of nowhere, and by 1950, it had become the nation's #1 killer. Doctors were stumped, and the public was desperate for answers. Enter a scientist named Ancel Keys. Keys was a biologist at the University of Minnesota, described by colleagues as brilliant, fiercely independent, and blessed with an iron will. He wasn't the type to accept conventional thinking. While most doctors figured heart disease was just an unfortunate part of getting older, Keys believed it could be prevented. He was determined to crack the case, and he zeroed in on one prime suspect: cholesterol. Cholesterol, this waxy substance in our tissues, had been found inside the gunky plaques clogging people's arteries. This led to a beautifully simple theory that still echoes today. Cholesterol in your food leads to cholesterol in your blood, which then clogs your arteries like grease down a cold drain. It's a vivid image. It made perfect sense. But here's the first plot twist. It was Ancel Keys himself who initially proved this theory wrong. In his own experiments, he fed volunteers massive amounts of cholesterol, up to 3,000 milligrams daily, that's like 15 eggs, and discovered it barely budged their blood cholesterol levels. By 1955, he concluded that dietary cholesterol was basically irrelevant. End quote. This point requires no further consideration. Turns out, our bodies are pretty smart. When we eat more cholesterol, our liver just makes less, keeping everything balanced. So if eating cholesterol wasn't the problem, what was? Keys pivoted. He proposed a new theory that would become known as the quote, diet heart hypothesis. It wasn't cholesterol in food, he argued, but the fat in food, especially saturated fat, that raised blood cholesterol and caused heart disease. To prove his point, he presented a chart in 1952 that would literally change the world. It was a simple graph plotting fat consumption against heart disease deaths in 6 countries. The result? A perfect, elegant, upward curve. Japan, with minimal dietary fat, had few heart disease deaths. The United States, at the top, had the highest fat intake and the most deaths. The message seemed crystal clear: eat less fat, save your life. This single chart became the seed from which our entire modern fear of fat grew. Every piece of advice you've ever heard about choosing skim over whole milk, chicken breast over steak, margarine over butter, can be traced directly back to this moment and to Ancel Keys's relentless drive. But there was a problem, a massive one. At a 1955 World Health Organization conference, a biostatistician named Jacob Yerushalmi stood up and challenged Keys. He pointed out that data on fat intake and heart disease existed for 22 countries, not just 6. What happened when you plotted all 22? The perfect curve disappeared. It was replaced by a chaotic scatter of dots with no clear pattern whatsoever. Countries like France and Switzerland had high-fat diets but low heart disease rates. Keys, it appeared, had cherry-picked his data to match his hypothesis. For most scientists, this would have been devastating, but Ancel Keys wasn't most scientists. Humiliated but unbowed, he declared he'd prove his critics wrong. He'd launched the most ambitious nutrition study in history, the 7 Countries Study. This study would track nearly 13,000 men across 7 countries to settle the debate once and for all. Yet once again, the country selection seemed suspiciously convenient. Keys chose places like Finland and Japan, which seemed likely to support his ideas, while avoiding France and Switzerland. His colleague later explained that Keys simply had a, quote, personal aversion to being in France and Switzerland. When the results emerged in 1970, they seemed like a knockout victory for Keys. The study showed a strong connection between eating saturated fat and dying from heart disease. Finnish men, who ate diets rich in dairy and meat, had sky-high heart disease rates. Greek men on the island of Crete, who ate very little, had almost none. Case closed, it seemed. Saturated fat was the killer. This finding became the foundation of nutritional policy for the next half-century. But when you dig deeper, as Nina Teicholz did, the foundation starts cracking. First, the correlation didn't even hold up within countries. Men in eastern Finland died at 3 times the rate of men in western Finland, despite eating virtually identical diets. Even more troubling, when Keys followed up 15 years later, he found that while low saturated fat was linked to fewer heart disease deaths, it wasn't associated with actually living longer. People on low-fat diets died just as often, they just died of different things. This critical finding has been buried for decades. Avoiding fat didn't extend anyone's life. Then there was the data itself. The dietary information for Greece, the country that would become the poster child for the healthy Mediterranean diet, was based on shockingly few men. And get this, a huge chunk of the data was collected during Lent, that 48-day period, when religious Greeks avoid all animal products, the main source of saturated fat. This incredible oversight meant the saturated fat intake of the healthy Cretans was massively undercounted. The 7-country study was epidemiological, meaning it could only show associations, not prove one thing caused another. Something else entirely might have explained the heart disease differences. In fact, years later, when an Italian researcher reanalyzed the data, he discovered the food category most strongly correlated with heart disease mortality wasn't saturated fat at all. It was sweets. The idea that sugar, not fat, might be the real villain was championed by a prominent British scientist named John Yudkin. But Ancel Keys would have none of it. He viciously attacked Yudkin's theory, dismissing it as a mountain of nonsense and accusing Yudkin and his commercial backers of ignoring facts. Keys was so convinced of his righteousness that he refused to seriously consider any alternative. The story of how this single, unproven idea became official dietary policy for the entire planet is a masterclass in how power, personality, and politics shape science. It wasn't just Keys. The idea needed powerful institutions behind it. The first and most crucial was the American Heart Association. In 1948, the AHA was a small, struggling group of doctors. Then something happened that changed everything. Procter & Gamble, makers of Crisco vegetable shortening, sponsored a radio contest and donated all proceeds, nearly $2 million, to the AHA. Suddenly, the AHA was a financial juggernaut, catapulted into national prominence by a company whose entire fortune was built on vegetable oil, the very product that would replace the animal fats the AHA was about to condemn. In 1961, with Ancel Keys and his ally Jeremiah Stamler now on the Nutrition Committee, the AHA released its first official dietary guidelines. It was Keys's diet heart hypothesis packaged as official advice. Americans should cut back on saturated fat and cholesterol to prevent heart attacks. This was a monumental victory for Keys. Just 2 weeks later, he graced the cover of Time magazine as Mr. Cholesterol. The idea got another huge boost when President Eisenhower suffered a heart attack in 1955. His personal doctor, Paul Dudley White, a friend and travel companion of Keys, held a press conference telling the entire nation to cut down on saturated fat. Eisenhower himself became obsessed with his cholesterol, switching to polyunsaturated margarine and Melba toast for breakfast. The message spread like wildfire. Animal fats were out, and a new hero was rising. That hero was vegetable oil. Before the early 1900s, vegetable oils like soybean, corn, and cottonseed weren't considered food at all. They were industrial products used to make soaps, candles, and lubricants. The fats in American kitchens were animal-based: lard, butter, tallow, and suet. But vegetable oils had one massive advantage: they were dirt cheap. The food industry spotted an opportunity. Through a chemical process called hydrogenation, they could transform these cheap liquid oils into solid fats that looked and behaved just like lard or butter. This gave birth to Crisco in 1911 and fueled margarine's rise. For decades, these were just budget alternatives, but when the AHA officially recommended replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated vegetable oils in 1961, they were suddenly rebranded as health foods. The industry pounced. Mazola corn oil ads urged consumers to, quote, "Take this ad to your doctor." The rush to jump on the polyunsaturated bandwagon, as one trade publication called it, became a stampede. And so Americans dutifully made the switch. We traded butter for margarine. We stopped cooking with lard and started using Crisco and Wesson oil. We believed we were protecting our hearts. But we were unknowingly swapping a traditional fat humans had eaten for thousands of years for an industrial product with a host of unknown consequences. The hydrogenation process that hardens vegetable oil creates a completely new type of artificial fat: trans fats. For most of the 20th century, the health effects of these fats were a mystery, and the industry worked overtime to keep it that way. A handful of scientists like Fred Kumerow at the University of Illinois started sounding alarms as early as the 1950s. He discovered these unnatural trans fats were accumulating in human tissues, including the heart and arteries, disrupting normal cell function. But whenever negative findings surfaced, the edible oil industry would fund its own studies to produce contradictory results, creating a fog of scientific uncertainty that allowed the ingredient to flourish. Industry chemists like Thomas Applewhite, who called himself the ringleader on trans, would show up at scientific conferences and aggressively challenge any researcher presenting critical data, effectively bullying scientists into silence. Kumerow found himself kicked out of AHA circles after trying to include a trans fat warning in their guidelines. The pamphlets were printed, but after the industry complained, the entire batch of 150,000 was destroyed and reprinted without the warning. The campaign to eliminate saturated fat from American diets only made things worse. In the 1980s, a powerful consumer group called the Center for Science in the Public Interest, believing saturated fat was the enemy, launched a, quote, saturated fat attack. They successfully pressured McDonald's and other fast food chains to stop frying French fries in beef tallow and switch to partially hydrogenated vegetable oil. Yep, trans fats. Meanwhile, the American Soybean Association, fearing competition from cheaper palm and coconut oils which are high in saturated fat, launched a massive, racially charged smear campaign calling them tree lard and portraying them as poison peddled by a surly-looking tropical fat cat. Shamed by this campaign and by full-page ads from millionaire activist Phil Sokoloff, food companies like Nabisco and General Mills reformulated thousands of products, replacing stable tropical oils with unstable trans-fat-laden hydrogenated oils. The result was a public health catastrophe. By the late 1980s, trans fats were in nearly everything: cookies, crackers, chips, frozen foods, accounting for a staggering 8% of all calories consumed by Americans. The crusade to eliminate one supposed evil, saturated fat, had led the entire nation to embrace something far, far worse. The tide finally began turning in 1990 when two Dutch researchers, Martien Catan and Ronald Mensink, published a groundbreaking study. They showed that trans fats didn't just raise bad LDL cholesterol, they also lowered good HDL cholesterol, a devastating double whammy for heart health. This was confirmed in a major USDA study, ironically funded by the very industry hoping to disprove it. But the real bombshell came in 1994, when Harvard epidemiologist Walter Willett published an explosive calculation based on his massive nurses' health study. He estimated that trans fats were causing 30,000 heart disease deaths in America every year. His announcement that eating just 4 teaspoons of margarine daily increased a woman's heart disease risk by 50% made global headlines and sent the food industry into panic mode. The fall of trans fats had begun. But this raised a critical question: what would replace them? And would it be any better? As food companies scrambled to remove trans fats ahead of a 2006 FDA labeling requirement, they faced a fundamental dilemma. They couldn't return to saturated fats like butter or lard because, after decades of anti-fat propaganda, consumers were terrified of them, so they needed a new solution. The answer, once again, was liquid vegetable oils: soybean, corn, canola, and safflower. These oils, long promoted as heart-healthy in liquid form, now flooded the food supply as the primary frying fat in restaurants and cafeterias nationwide. But here's yet another surprise, possibly an even bigger one. These oils come with their own serious, largely hidden dangers. These oils are polyunsaturated, meaning their chemical structure is unstable. When heated, they oxidize and break down into toxic compounds, including aldehydes, one of which is formaldehyde, the chemical used to preserve corpses. One scientist described the gunk building up in restaurant fryers from these oils as a sticky, horrible witch's brew. The International Agency for Research on Cancer has classified emissions from frying these oils as probably carcinogenic to humans. And this doesn't even count the toxic compounds absorbed into the food itself. Even at room temperature, these oils are problematic. They're overwhelmingly high in omega-6 fats. While our bodies need a balance of omega-6 and omega-3 fats found in fish, the tsunami of vegetable oils in our diet has completely destroyed that balance. This omega-6 excess is now believed to promote the kind of inflammation that drives heart disease. So the 60-year war on saturated fat has led us down a dangerous path, first to artificial trans fats, and now to unstable, potentially toxic vegetable oils. We jumped from the frying pan into the fire, and then into another fire. Throughout this entire saga, there's been an alternative narrative, a parallel universe of research that was dismissed, ignored, and ridiculed for decades. This is the story suggesting the real dietary villain was never fat at all. It was carbohydrates. This wasn't a new idea. Back in 1863, an English undertaker named William Banting published a pamphlet describing how he cured his obesity and various health problems by giving up bread, sugar, beer, and potatoes, while eating meat, fish, and game instead. His high-fat, low-carb approach became wildly popular. Throughout the early 20th century, doctors like Blake Donaldson treated thousands of patients successfully with an all-meat, high-fat diet, observing that it not only caused weight loss, but also seemed to resolve heart disease, diabetes, and high blood pressure. These doctors were rediscovering an ancient truth. Obesity isn't a calorie problem, but a hormone problem. The key hormone is insulin. Your body releases insulin primarily when you eat carbohydrates. Insulin's job is shuttling glucose from your blood into your cells for energy. But it has another critical function. It tells your fat cells to store fat and, crucially, to stop releasing it for fuel.